I was a successful surgeon, husband and father until one patient ruined everything. He was 23, with brown hair, eyes like a stormy sky, and a body that drew the eye. In that operating room, I lost control, and in the locked back room, I lost myself. This is my confession about how one moment changed everything. Dr. Ethan Reed had built a life most people only dreamed of. At 38, he was a respected surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, a city that thrived on prestige and precision, two things Ethan had mastered. His days were a symphony of controlled chaos, the steady beep of monitors, the rustle of scrubs as nurses darted through the halls, and the faint hum of his own confidence as he saved lives. At home, his wife Emily greeted him with a warm smile, her brown hair pulled back in a messy bun after a long day of teaching. Their 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, would run to him, her tiny arms wrapping around his legs, her laughter a balm to his soul. Ethan had it all figured out, every step of his career, every milestone of his family life meticulously planned. Until the day it all started to unravel. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in October, the kind where the air smelled of fallen leaves and antiseptic. Ethan stood in the hospital's break room, sipping burnt coffee from a paper cup, flipping through patient charts on his tablet. His dark eyes scanned the screen, his tall frame, 6 feet 3 inches and still lean from years of discipline, hunched slightly over the counter. He was in his element, unshakable, until a nurse burst through the door, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Dr. Reed, we've got a trauma case in the ER. Male, 23, motorcycle crash. Minor injuries, but he's asking for you specifically. Says he won't let anyone else touch him." Ethan raised an eyebrow, setting the coffee down. "Me? Why?" The nurse shrugged, her ponytail bouncing. "No idea. He's stable, just banged up. Room 4. Curiosity piqued, Ethan nodded and headed toward the emergency room, his strides long and purposeful. He'd seen his share of demanding patients, entitled types who thought a doctor's title was a personal servant's bell, but this felt different. The air buzzed with an odd energy as he approached the curtain-off bay. He steeled himself for another routine case, pulling back the curtain with a practiced flick of his wrist. And then he froze. Lying on the gurney was Kyle Evans, a 23-year-old who looked like he'd stepped out of a Hollywood casting call. His sandy blonde hair was tousled, streaked with dirt and sweat from the crash, framing a face that was almost too perfect, sharp jawline, high cheekbones, and a smattering of freckles that softened his edges. But it was his eyes that hit Ethan like a punch to the chest, stormy gray, piercing, and locked onto him with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. Kyle wasn't wearing a shirt, his lean, muscular torso rising and falling with shallow breaths. A jagged scrape ran across his collarbone, blood crusting at the edges, but even the injury couldn't detract from the raw, magnetic pull of his presence. "Hey," Kyle said, his voice low and steady despite the circumstances. "You must be Dr. Reed." "I'm Kyle. Kyle Evans." Ethan blinked, forcing his professional mask back into place. "Good morning, Kyle," he said, his tone smoother than he felt. "I hear you've been in a bit of a scrape. Mind telling me what happened?" Kyle grinned, a flash of white teeth that felt oddly disarming. "Took a corner too fast on my bike. Hit some gravel, went down. Nothing dramatic, just stupid. Hurts like hell, though." Ethan nodded, stepping closer to assess the damage. He pulled on a pair of gloves, the snap of latex grounding him as he tried to ignore the way Kyle's gaze followed his every move. "Let's take a look," he said, keeping his voice clipped. He leaned in, inspecting the scrape and a bruise blooming across Kyle's ribs. The guy's skin was warm under his touch, even through the gloves, and Ethan's pulse kicked up a notch, unwelcome, unprofessional, and entirely unexpected. "Does it hurt when I press here?" Ethan asked, his fingers brushing the edge of the bruise. Kyle winced slightly, but his eyes never left Ethan's. "A little. You've got steady hands, document, bet that comes in handy in the OR." Ethan forced a tight smile, focusing on the task. "Years of practice. You're lucky it's just surface stuff. No broken bones, from what I can tell. We'll get you cleaned up and run some scans to be sure." "Cool," Kyle said, leaning back slightly, his posture relaxed despite the pain. "I knew you'd be the guy to fix me up. Heard you're the best around here." Ethan paused, meeting those gray eyes again. There was something in them, something beyond casual gratitude. A spark, a challenge, a pull Ethan couldn't name. "Just doing my job," he said, turning to grab a sterile gauze pad from the tray. But as he worked, cleaning the scrape with careful precision, he couldn't shake the feeling that Kyle saw right through him, through the crisp white coat, the wedding band on his finger, the life he'd so carefully built. "You married, Doc?" Kyle asked suddenly, his tone light but edged with something sharper. Ethan's hand stilled for a fraction of a second. "Yeah," he said, keeping his voice even. "Why?" Kyle shrugged, a lazy roll of his shoulders. "Just curious. You seem like a guy who's got it all together. Wife, kids, big career. Am I right?" "Something like that," Ethan replied, his jaw tightening. He finished bandaging the scrape and stepped back, stripping off his gloves. "You're all set for now. A nurse will take you for imaging. Rest up, okay?" Kyle nodded, but his smile lingered, slow and knowing. "Thanks, Dr. Reed. See you around?" Ethan didn't answer, just gave a curt nod and turned to leave. As he pushed through the curtain, the weight of Kyle's gaze clung to him like a second skin. He told himself it was nothing, just a charismatic kid with a knack for getting under people's armor. But deep down, in a place he didn't dare look too closely at, Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The fluorescent lights of Massachusetts General buzzed overhead as Ethan moved through his rounds the next day, his mind a tangle of charts and checklists. He'd slept poorly, waking with the echo of Kyle Evans' gray eyes burned into his thoughts. It was ridiculous, he told himself. Patients came and went, some more memorable than others, but none had ever lingered like this. He chalked it up to exhaustion, to the weight of a long week, and pushed it down as he scrubbed in for a scheduled bypass surgery. The operating room was his sanctuary, a place where control reigned supreme, and he needed that now more than ever. But when he stepped out of the OR 4 hours later, sweat still clinging to his brow, a nurse caught him in the hall. "Dr. Reed, that kid from yesterday, Kyle Evans, he's asking for you again. Says his pain's worse." Ethan's stomach tightened, a flicker of unease cutting through his post-surgery high. "Worse? Did anyone check him?" "Yeah, Dr. Patel looked him over. Says it's just bruising, maybe some inflammation. Kid's insistent, though. Won't settle down till you see him." Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fine. I'll swing by. Room 4 still?" "Moved him to 12 on the ward," the nurse said, handing him a chart before hurrying off. The walk to room 12 felt longer than it should have, each step heavy with a mix of dread and something he refused to name. When he pushed open the door, Kyle was sitting up in bed, his blonde hair catching the sunlight streaming through the window. He'd been given a hospital gown, but it hung loose, exposing the curve of his shoulder and the bruise Ethan had examined yesterday. Those gray eyes lit up when they landed on him, a slow smile spreading across Kyle's face. "Dr. Reed," Kyle said, his voice warm, almost teasing. "Knew you'd come." Ethan kept his expression neutral, stepping to the bedside. "Heard you're in more pain. Where's it at?" Kyle gestured vaguely to his side. "Here, mostly. Feels like someone's jabbing me with a hot poker. You gonna fix me up again?" Ethan set the chart down and leaned in, pressing gently along Kyle's ribs. The guy flinched, but his gaze stayed locked on Ethan's face, unwavering. "Any trouble breathing?" Ethan asked, his tone clipped. "Nah, just hurts when I move. Or laugh. Which sucks, 'cause you're kinda funny when you're all serious like that." Ethan's lips twitched despite himself, but he smothered the reaction. "You're lucky it's not cracked. Just bruised, like Dr. Patel said. I'll up your anti-inflammatories. Should ease up soon." Kyle tilted his head, studying him. "You check on all your patients this much, or am I special?" The question hung in the air, light but loaded. Ethan straightened, crossing his arms. "I check on whoever needs it. You're not dying, Kyle. You'll be out of here in a day or two." "Shame," Kyle said, his smile turning sly. "I'm starting to like the service." Ethan ignored the bait, jotting a note on the chart. But as he turned to leave, Kyle's voice stopped him. "Hey, Doc, can I ask you something?" He hesitated, glancing back. "If it's quick. You ever get tired of it? Playing the perfect guy all the time?" Ethan's chest tightened, the words slicing deeper than they should have. I don't play anything, he said, his voice low. I do my job. That's it. Kyle shrugged, unfazed. Sure. Just seems like a lot of pressure. Bet you're good at hiding it, though. The room felt too small, the air too thick. Ethan muttered a goodbye and left, his pulse hammering. He spent the rest of his shift burying himself in work, avoiding room 12 like it was a live wire. But the next morning, he found himself back there, unbidden, almost automatic, checking Kyle's chart at the nurse's station before slipping into the room. Kyle was awake, propped against pillows, scrolling on his phone. He looked up, grinning. Miss me already? Ethan didn't smile back. Just making sure you're not causing trouble. How's the pain? Better, thanks to you, Kyle said, setting the phone down. You're spoiling me, document don't stop now. There it was again, that tone, playful but edged with something heavier. Ethan busied himself adjusting the foredrip, avoiding those eyes. You're healing fine. No need for me to hover. Maybe I like it when you hover. Kyle shot back, his voice dropping. You're different from the others. Real. Makes me wonder what's under all that doctor armor. Ethan's hand faltered on the foreline, a jolt running through him. You don't know me, he said, sharper than intended. Don't I? Kyle leaned forward slightly, wincing but undeterred. I see how you look at me. Like you're fighting something. What's it gonna take to stop fighting? The words hit like a freight train. Ethan stepped back, his throat dry. I'm your doctor, Kyle. That's all this is. Kyle's smile faded, but his gaze held steady. Keep telling yourself that. Later that afternoon, Ethan was charting in the lounge when Kyle's voice echoed in his head again. He needed air, distance, anything to shake this off. But then Kyle's chart flagged, minor swelling in his leg, probably from sitting too long. He could have sent a resident, but his feet carried him back to room 12 anyway. Kyle was standing by the bed, testing his weight on the leg, when Ethan walked in. Hey, perfect timing, he said. Mind helping me to the bathroom? Legs stiff. Ethan nodded, professionalism locking back into place. He slid an arm around Kyle's back, supporting him as they shuffled across the room. Kyle's body was warm against his grip on Ethan's shoulder tighter than necessary. When they reached the bathroom, Kyle stepped inside and turned, his hand lingering on Ethan's arm. Come in for a sec, he said, his voice soft but insistent. I need to talk to you. Ethan's gut screamed to say no, but Kyle's eyes, those damn gray eyes, pulled him in. The door clicked shut behind them, and Kyle flipped the lock. The sound was sharp, final, and Ethan felt the walls close in. What's this about? He asked, his voice low, strained. Kyle leaned against the sink, his expression shifting, less playful, more raw. You feel it too, don't you? This thing between us. I'm not imagining it. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. Kyle, this isn't. Don't. Kyle cut in, stepping closer. Don't lie to me. Or yourself? The space between them shrank, the air crackling with unspoken tension. Ethan knew he should walk away, unlock the door, end this now. But his feet wouldn't move, and Kyle's gaze held him captive, daring him to cross a line he never imagined breaching. The locked bathroom door seemed to pulse in Ethan's ears, the sharp click still reverberating as he stood frozen, inches from Kyle Evans. The sterile tile walls of the Massachusetts General bathroom closed in, the faint hum of the vent overhead drowned out by the thud of his own heartbeat. Kyle leaned against the sink, his gray eyes boring into Ethan's with a mix of defiance and vulnerability that made it impossible to look away. The air between them crackled, thick with something Ethan had spent days trying to deny. Kyle, we can't. Ethan started, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. He took a half step back, his hand reaching for the lock, but Kyle's words stopped him cold. Why not? Kyle's tone was steady, cutting through the haze. You're here. You didn't have to be. But you are. Ethan's jaw tightened, his fingers hovering over the door handle. I'm your doctor. This is inappropriate. I've got a wife, a kid. I'm not asking you to ditch them. Kyle interrupted, stepping closer. His hospital gown shifted, exposing more of his bruised shoulder, and Ethan's eyes flicked to it before snapping back to Kyle's face. I'm asking you to stop pretending you don't feel this. Feel what? Ethan snapped, his voice louder now, edged with frustration. You're a patient. You're young, you're hurt, and you're reading too much into this. Kyle's lips curved into a small, bitter smile. Am I? Tell me you haven't been checking on me more than you need to. Tell me you don't look at me like I'm more than just some guy on a gurney. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He had been checking on Kyle too often. He had felt that pull, that inexplicable draw that made his skin prickle every time those gray eyes met his. He shook his head, turning away, gripping the edge of the sink so hard his knuckles paled. This isn't who I am, he muttered, more to himself than to Kyle. Then who are you? Kyle's voice softened, but it carried a challenge. He closed the distance between them, his bare arm brushing Ethan's sleeve. The perfect doctor? The perfect husband? Or just a guy who's scared to admit he wants something he's not supposed to? Ethan's breath hitched, his resolve fraying. He turned to face Kyle, intending to shut this down, to reassert the boundary he'd always lived by. But Kyle was too close now, his scent, a mix of hospital soap and something uniquely him, flooding Ethan's senses. Before he could speak, Kyle reached up, his hand resting lightly on Ethan's chest, just over his heart. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through him that rooted him to the spot. Kyle, don't. Ethan's voice broke, weaker than he'd ever heard it. Tell me to stop, Kyle whispered, his fingers curling into the fabric of Ethan's scrubs. Say it, and I will. Ethan's mind screamed at him to say it, to end this madness before it went too far. But his body betrayed him, his hand trembling as it rose to cover Kyle's, not pushing it away but holding it there. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Kyle leaned in, his lips brushing Ethan's in a tentative, searing kiss. For a split second, Ethan froze, every rational thought clawing at him to pull back. But then something snapped, a dam breaking, years of restraint crumbling in an instant. He kissed Kyle back, hard and desperate, his hands finding Kyle's waist and pulling him closer. The world tilted, the bathroom shrinking to just the heat of Kyle's mouth, the press of his body, the soft gasp he let out as Ethan deepened the kiss. It was reckless, wrong, and yet it felt like the most honest thing he'd done in years. Kyle's hands slid up to Ethan's shoulders, gripping tight, his fingers digging in as if anchoring himself. Ethan pressed him back against the sink, the edge biting into Kyle's hips, but neither of them cared. The kiss turned frantic, a collision of need and guilt, Ethan's mind a whirlwind of I shouldn't and I can't stop. Kyle's lips parted, inviting more, and Ethan gave in, tasting the salt of his skin as his mouth trailed to Kyle's jaw, then his neck. Ethan! Kyle breathed, his voice shaky, raw. It was the first time he'd used his first name, and it hit like a thunderbolt, sacred and shattering. Ethan pulled back just enough to look at him, chest heaving, Kyle's gray eyes wide and glassy with desire. You wanted this, Kyle murmured, a faint smile tugging at his swollen lips. I knew it. Reality crashed in like a tidal wave. Ethan staggered back, his hands dropping to his sides, his breath ragged. No, he said, the word hollow. This can't happen. I'm married, Kyle. I have a family. Kyle straightened, his expression flickering, hurt, then something harder. I'm not asking you to leave them, he said quietly. I just wanted you to feel it. To stop hiding. Stop hiding? Ethan laughed, a harsh, broken sound. You don't get it. This isn't some game. I've got a life, a daughter, a wife who trusts me. I can't just... He cut himself off, turning to the mirror. His reflection stared back, dark eyes wild, face flushed, a man he didn't recognize. His hands shook as he gripped the sink again, guilt clawing at his gut. What had he done? He'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross, and the weight of it threatened to crush him. Kyle stepped closer, his hand brushing Ethan's arm. Ethan, look at me! Don't! Ethan snapped, shrugging him off. This was a mistake. It's over. Kyle flinched, his jaw tightening. A mistake? That's what you're calling it. Yes, Ethan said, forcing the word out, though it tasted like ash. I don't know what I was thinking, but it stops here. Kyle's eyes searched his, a storm brewing behind them. You can lie to yourself all you want, he said, his voice low. But we both know what just happened. And it meant something. Ethan didn't respond. He unlocked the door, the click echoing like a gunshot, and walked out without looking back. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, his footsteps heavy, each one pounding with the truth he couldn't escape. Kyle was right. It had meant something. And that terrified him more than anything. As he rounded the corner, disappearing into the bustle of the hospital, he didn't see Kyle lean against the bathroom wall, his hand pressed to his lips, a quiet resolve settling into his gaze. This wasn't over, not for him. Ethan Reed barely slept that night. The memory of Kyle's lips, the heat of his touch, clung to him like a fever he couldn't shake. He lay in bed next to Emily, her soft breathing a stark contrast to the chaos in his head. Sophie's laughter from yesterday's bedtime story echoed faintly, a reminder of everything he stood to lose. He'd crossed the line in that bathroom, stupid, reckless, unforgivable, and now he had to bury it. By morning, he'd resolved to avoid Kyle entirely, delegating his care to Dr. Patel and focusing on the life he'd built. But resolutions, he'd soon learn, were fragile things. At Massachusetts General, Ethan threw himself into work, scrubbing in for an appendectomy and losing himself in the rhythm of scalpel and suture. The OR was his refuge, a place where he could silence the guilt gnawing at his chest. But when he stepped out, peeling off his gloves, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A notification from Instagram, a platform he rarely used, flashed on the screen. The message was from an account he didn't recognize, K.Evans23. His stomach dropped. Meet me at the Common Grounds Cafe off Tremont St, 7 p.m. We need to talk. Don't make me tell Emily what happened. The words stared up at him, cold and sharp, a blade pressed to his throat. Ethan's hands shook as he reread it, the hospital's hum fading into a dull roar. Kyle wasn't letting this go. He'd found Ethan's personal account. How? And now he was leveraging the one thing Ethan couldn't risk, his family. He should have ignored it, blocked the account, and moved on. But the threat lingered, a ticking bomb. What if Kyle wasn't bluffing? What if he had proof, a photo, a text, something Ethan hadn't even thought of? By 6:45, he was in his car, driving through Boston's twilight streets, the city lights blurring past as his grip tightened on the wheel. He told Emily he had a late consult, another lie to add to the pile. The cafe was a cozy hole in the wall, all exposed brick and warm lighting, but it felt suffocating as Ethan stepped inside. Kyle was already there, sitting in a corner booth, his blonde hair catching the glow of a pendant lamp. He wore a black hoodie and jeans, looking younger, almost ordinary, except for the glint in his gray eyes when he spotted Ethan. He waved him over with a casual flick of his hand, like this was a friendly catch-up. Ethan slid into the seat across from him, his voice low and tight. What the hell do you want, Kyle? Kyle leaned back, sipping a coffee, his expression unreadable. Relax, document. I just wanted to see you. You bolted yesterday, didn't give me a chance to say much. You're blackmailing me. Ethan hissed, leaning forward. You think this is a game? I told you it's over. Whatever happened, it's done. Kyle's smile faded, replaced by something colder. It's not over for me. He set the cup down, his fingers tapping the table. I meant what I said. That kiss, it wasn't nothing. And I don't think it was for you either. Ethan's jaw clenched. I'm not doing this. You don't get to decide what it meant. I've got a wife, a daughter. Yeah, I know. Kyle cut in, his tone sharpening. And I'm not asking you to leave them. But I'm not some dirty secret you can just scrub away either. He pulled out his phone, swiping the screen to life. See, I've been thinking. Maybe Emily deserves to know what kind of guy she's married to. Maybe Sophie's school could use a little heads up about their star dad. Ethan's blood ran cold. You wouldn't. Wouldn't I? Kyle tilted his head, his voice dropping. Here's the thing, Ethan. My dad's Edward Evans. Big shot lawyer, knows every judge in this city. One word from me, and your career's toast. Forget the hospital, think lawsuits, headlines, the works. The name hit Ethan like a brick. Edward Evans wasn't just a lawyer. He was a legal titan, the kind who crushed opponents for sport. Ethan's mind raced, piecing it together, Kyle's confidence, his ease with manipulation. This wasn't some impulsive kid, this was a predator who'd played him from the start. "You're threatening me," he said, his voice barely steady. "For what? What do you even want?" Kyle leaned in, his gray eyes locking onto Ethan's. "You," he said simply. "One night. No strings, no promises. Just you and me, no pretending. Then I walk away, and your perfect little life stays intact." Ethan stared at him, disbelief warring with rage. "You're insane. I'm not some toy you can bargain for." "Call it what you want," Kyle said, shrugging. "But I've got the cards here. You say no, I make a call. You say yes, we're even. Your choice." The cafe's chatter faded to a distant hum as Ethan's world narrowed to the man across from him. He thought of Emily's trusting smile, Sophie's tiny hand in his, the years he'd spent building a reputation now dangling by a thread. He could walk away, call Kyle's bluff, but what if it wasn't a bluff? What if this kid, barely 23, with a smirk and a power play, really could unravel everything? "I need time," Ethan said finally, his voice hoarse. "To think." Kyle's smile returned, triumphant. "You've got till tomorrow night. Same place, 7 p.m. Don't ghost me, Doc, I'll know." He slid out of the booth, tossing a few bucks on the table, and walked out, leaving Ethan alone with the weight of his words. The drive home was a blur. Ethan's hands trembled on the wheel, his mind spinning. He could tell Emily, come clean, and face the fallout. Or he could meet Kyle, give in, and pray it ended there. Neither choice felt real, both were a betrayal, one of his family, the other of himself. When he slipped into bed beside Emily, her warmth only deepened the ache in his chest. She stirred, murmuring, "Late night?" "Yeah," he lied, his voice cracking. "Tough case." She squeezed his hand, drifting back to sleep, oblivious to the storm inside him. Ethan stared at the ceiling, Kyle's ultimatum looping in his head. One night, or everything crumbles. He didn't know what he'd do, but one thing was clear, Kyle had him trapped, and the clock was ticking. Outside, the city hummed on, indifferent to the war Ethan was losing within himself. Tomorrow loomed like a guillotine, and he had no idea which way the blade would fall. Ethan Reed spent the next day in a fog, the ultimatum from Kyle Evans like a noose tightening around his neck. He moved through Massachusetts General on autopilot, signing charts, consulting patients, nodding at colleagues, while his mind churned. One night with Kyle, or his life implodes. The cafe meeting replayed endlessly, Kyle's smug grin, the casual way he dropped his father's name like a loaded gun. Ethan's hands shook as he scrubbed in for a procedure, the sterile or offering no escape from the guilt and fear gnawing at him. He couldn't do it, couldn't betray Emily and Sophie again, but the alternative felt just as impossible. By afternoon, he'd made a choice. Not the one Kyle wanted, but the one he should have made from the start. He left the hospital early, driving home through Boston's gray streets, the weight of his decision settling like concrete in his chest. Emily was in the kitchen when he walked in, chopping carrots for dinner, her brown hair tied back. Sophie sat at the table, coloring a picture of a unicorn, her tongue poking out in concentration. The normalcy of it nearly broke him. Ethan said, his voice rough. "We need to talk." She looked up, frowning at his tone. "Everything okay?" He shook his head, gesturing to the living room. Once they were alone, the words spilled out, halting, raw, unpolished. The kiss in the bathroom, Kyle's blackmail, the cafe meeting. He didn't sugarcoat it, didn't hide the shame that burned his throat. Emily listened, her face paling, her hands twisting in her lap. When he finished, silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. "You kissed him," she said finally, her voice trembling. "And he's threatening us?" "Yeah," Ethan whispered, staring at the floor. "I'm so sorry, Em. I messed up, bad. I don't know how to fix it, but I couldn't keep lying." She stood, pacing, tears glistening in her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Before it got this far?" "I was scared," he admitted. "Scared of losing you, Sophie, everything. I thought I could handle it, but I can't." Emily stopped, wiping her face. "I'm furious, Ethan. And hurt. But I'd rather you told me than let him hold this over us." She took a shaky breath. "What do we do?" Ethan looked up, resolve hardening. I'm going to the hospital board. And the police, if it comes to that. He's not getting away with this. That evening, Ethan drafted an email to the hospital's ethics committee, detailing Kyle's actions, every visit, the bathroom incident, the blackmail. He attached a screenshot of the Instagram message, his hands steady for the first time in days. Emily sat beside him, her presence a quiet anchor as he hit send. Then he called the cafe's number, leaving a message for Kyle. I'm not coming. Do what you want, I'm done. The next morning, the fallout began. Ethan met with the hospital's chief of staff, Dr. Linda Hayes, a no-nonsense woman with steel-gray hair. She read his report, her expression darkening. This is serious, Ethan. If he's leveraging his father's influence, we'll need to investigate. You should have reported the bathroom incident immediately, but I get why you didn't. I know, Ethan said, his voice low. I take full responsibility. She nodded. We'll handle it. And you might want to lawyer up, just in case. By midday, Kyle made his move. A formal complaint landed on Dr. Hayes' desk, accusing Ethan of inappropriate conduct with a patient. But Ethan's preemptive strike had shifted the narrative. The hospital launched an internal review, pulling Kyle's medical records and interviewing staff. Nurses confirmed Ethan's frequent visits to room 12, but they also noted Kyle's flirtatious behavior, his odd insistence on Ethan's care. The Instagram message sealed it, blackmail, plain and simple. Then came the twist. A junior resident, overhearing the buzz, mentioned a rumor Kyle had pulled a similar stunt at a clinic in Providence 2 years back, targeting a married nurse. The case had been hushed up, likely by Edward Evans' legal muscle, but it gave the hospital leverage. Dr. Hayes contacted the police, and a detective dug into Kyle's past. What emerged was a pattern, a charming manipulator who preyed on authority figures, using his father's name as a shield. Ethan faced his own reckoning. The board suspended him pending review, not a firing, but a bruise to his record. Emily stood by him, though their trust was a fragile thing, rebuilt day by day. Sophie, oblivious, hugged him tighter at night, sensing something was off. The guilt lingered, but confessing had lifted a weight he hadn't realized he'd carried. Kyle's gambit backfired spectacularly. When the police questioned him, he cracked, admitting he'd exaggerated the complaint to teach Ethan a lesson. Edward Evans swooped in, all bluster and threats, but the evidence was damning. A local news outlet caught wind of the story. Lawyer's son in hospital scandal. And Edward's pristine reputation took a hit. Kyle faced misdemeanor charges for harassment, his smug confidence replaced by a sullen glare in his mugshot. Weeks later, Ethan sat on his porch, the crisp November air biting his skin. Emily joined him, handing him a coffee. Board's reinstating you next month, she said. You okay with that? He nodded, sipping the drink. Yeah. I'll earn it back, their trust yours. I'm not that guy anymore, Em. She squeezed his hand, her smile small but real. I know. We'll get through it. Inside, Sophie's laughter drifted out, a lifeline pulling him back to who he was supposed to be. Kyle was gone, out of the hospital, out of their lives, but the lesson remained. Ethan had fallen, but he'd chosen truth over shame. And in the end, that was enough.